What's going on, y'all? So I went to go see the new Michael Jackson movie about a few weeks ago, and I thought it was dope. It was really good. And I don't know what the hell these mainstream critics and Rotten Tomatoes was talking about because I thought Jafar Jackson did an amazing job. He hit it right on target, I think. And we got to talk about how massive this movie is right now because when they first said that they was making a Michael Jackson movie, everybody on the internet, including me, was kind of doubtful about it because folks were like, nah, there's no way Hollywood could pull this shit off. But the second we saw those trailers and highlights of Jafar Jackson performing as Mike, the whole conversation changed. Now people couldn't wait to go see it. And I felt that this film was necessary for these divisive times, and the crowd told me everything I needed to know. Because when I walked in that theater, the room was diverse. You had different cultures all coming together, folks who may not have nothing in common in their day to day lives, yet they were all sitting in the same room ready to celebrate his legacy. And ever since the premiere of this movie came about, we've been seeing how adults, teenagers, and even kids of all races who wasn't even born when Michael was around, they're dressing up in thriller jackets, the military suits, the whole Billie Jean wardrobes, like the fedoras, the sequin gloves, and the black glitter jacket. Like I saw a Japanese girl dressed as that when I first walked into the lobby. And far as this generation goes, like the young people today, like toddlers, kids, and teens, I get it because they wasn't around when the allegations was going on. They wasn't being manipulated by the media. But with some of these grown folks who are older, like 35 and up, who are dressing up like Michael Jackson, I got to question some of them because I know some of them might have bashed Michael back in the day and suddenly fell in love with him again when he passed. But and by this movie being out, that they're getting caught up in the hype, and I just feel that some of them are faking the funk. But with the younger people, I get because they didn't grow up being conditioned by the media, the 24/7 tabloids. Because I mean, look at it. The corporate gatekeepers tried it again just a few years ago with that Leaving Neverland documentary. They threw everything they had at the wall, trying to paint him a certain way and bury his legacy for good. They expected this new generation to completely counsel him, but these young folks weren't being manipulated by the media machine. They wasn't worried about that shit. They just looked at the man's music and artistry for what it was, not giving a shit about the old corporate gatekeepers or their documentaries. And that's why his legacy still stands the test of time. But looking at this movie, the actual storyline of the movie, I really liked how they set up the drama. Having him face his antagonist, which was his dad, Joe Jackson, who was brutal and mean. And I get that there could have been a balance with Coleman Domingo's character as Joe, like Lawrence Hilton Jacobs' portrayal of Joe, because at least that Joe was a little bit more humanized. But I understand that keeping this Joe as the villain was actually the right choice for the purpose of this movie. And I could hear people talking in the theater, and some people, they still don't know Michael Jackson's story because while I was sitting in there, I could hear a grown woman asking whoever she was with, why do you call him Joseph? Because if you know Michael Jackson's story, everybody called him Joseph. All his children did. They didn't want him. He didn't want them calling him Dad because I guess he wanted them to see him more as their manager instead of their father. So I'm like, for a grown person not to know that, you're not up on that. But this movie starts out in 1966, where the kid actor Giuliano Cruvaldi played little boy Mike, and Jafar playing Mike as an adult as he rose to fame. And I wasn't expecting to learn anything new from this movie because I've heard people say, oh, it didn't go deep into certain stuff, but that's cool. I wasn't expecting it. I just went for the entertainment. But there was a time during the movie when it touched on the MTV situation, showing how Mike and CBS had to fight just to get Billie Jean on the air. And while I was sitting in there in that theater watching this, it made me wonder what if they really exposed more of the heavy systemic racism that he faced throughout his entire life, things that the public system never really seen or talked about before. Because when the movie was showing the family moving into that big beautiful mansion in Encino at the beginning, they made it seem like it was a dream. But what they didn't show you is that when they finally made enough money to buy that Havenhurst estate in the early 70s, they was met with some hostility because before they even unpacked a single bag, a group of white neighbors actually started a petition to try to keep them out. Their property was vandalized. Catherine's car was keyed, And this was when the Jackson 5 was already famous superstars with all that Motown money and hit records, but they still wasn't good enough to live on that block. Or we could talk about Michael facing racial profiling as a young man to where he was getting racially profiled constantly down in California. Because he'd be driving in his Rolls Royce or Mercedes, and the cops will pull him over because they couldn't believe that a young black man owned that luxury vehicle. Now, what they tell us about the story behind that song Speed Demon was that Mike was driving to the studio during the bass sessions, got pulled over and got a speeding ticket because he was trying to get away from paparazzi and photographers or whatever. And when he showed up late, he was furious. And Quincy Jones told him to just channel that frustration and adrenaline straight into the song. And that's the fun Hollywood trivia everybody knows. But what they don't talk about is the deeper reality of what it actually meant to be a young, ultra wealthy black man driving a luxury car in California. And that constant aggressive surveillance that Mike got from the cops is the exact real life frustration that inspired him to write that song Speed Demon later on. Because in that song, there's a lyric that goes, "Pull over, boy, and get your ticket right." He used that word boy specifically because that's how racist police officers often address black men, to make them feel less than a man. It was his way of putting his real life frustration with being pulled over into his art. You know, people will hear that song and think it's just a fun track about driving fast, but it's much deeper than that. It was about the system constantly breathing down his neck from day one. And people would think that putting those certain scenes in there about his life, you know, that we don't know about would have gave the movie more depth, which it would have. But I'm like, nah, the Joe and Michael narrative is perfect as it is because that's more universal. Because if they put the raw, uncomfortable truth of what Michael went through on that screen, as far as racism, it would have made mainstream white audiences feel uncomfortable. It wouldn't have been that safe, feel good, unifying blockbuster that Hollywood needed to make that $700, $800 million. So they chose mass appeal over the hard truths. But like I said, I just went for the entertainment and a great story behind the music. And that's exactly what we got. You know, the recreations of Thriller and the Billie Jean performance was dope. But for me, the most nostalgic moment of the entire film was at the very end, the Bad Tour performance, because the Bad era is probably the earliest memory I have of Michael Jackson, because I remember being a kid watching videos like Bad and The Way You Make Me Feel on Video Soul on TV in my parents' bedroom. You know, I didn't grow up with the Jackson 5, the Jacksons, Off the Wall, or Thriller. I mean, I grew up watching and listening to all that later on, but I didn't grow up with it, living through it day by day like I did with Bad, Dangerous, and so forth. But by stopping the movie in 1988, Hollywood gave us this safe fairy tale that left the back door wide open. And with part two coming out, we was thinking Michael's reputation would be restored because Lionsgate had just confirmed that this sequel was being written to cover the rest of the Bad era, the 90s and the 2000s. You know, but because this movie made $800 million and the media can't handle that success, now they're playing desperate chess games to take back the control of his legacy. Which brings us to what Netflix is trying to pull on Wednesday, June 3rd. And it's like they couldn't have picked a better time to try to destroy his legacy. But they just rushed out a trailer for a new documentary called The Verdict. And the timing of this release is not an accident because they seen how successful this movie was. And Netflix is terrified of a sequel showing the raw truth on the big screen. And see, this is where pure capitalism comes into play because in the entertainment business, information is money, and whoever controls the story controls the bag. Netflix ain't just trying to tell a story here. They're protecting their pockets. You know, by dropping their project right now, they're trying to step on the competition and kill the money momentum of a sequel before it even gets off the ground. And, you know, because they want to drop this doc on June 3rd because they want to try to build this psychological wall in our minds before part two could even film a single scene. You know, instead of moving forward, they want us to go back in time. They want us to listen to those dudes who flip-flopped, the same dudes who swore under oath in a real court of law that Mike was innocent when he was alive. But the second he dies and can't defend himself, suddenly they remember a whole new story just in time to file a $1 billion lawsuit. I mean, the hustle is just too obvious. Now, let me give you my straight, honest perspective on this. Personally, I believe Michael was a good dude, and I truly don't believe he was ever guilty of those crimes. But to be real with you, he did bring some of those problems on himself by being too trusting and not realizing that the world doesn't always see things the way he did. And I get it, he loved children. That's cool, and I understand because kids, they're they're natural and innocent. And I've noticed myself that adults can be more difficult to deal with than children sometimes, because at least when kids act up, it's expected because they're kids. But letting them sleep in the same bed with you, I mean, that's not normal because some of the stuff that he did, it didn't look right. And looking at it from a real street level standpoint, I would say that Mike just had bad judgment, and I felt that he should have been spending more time with his nieces and nephews, but instead he was opening doors to these suburban white kids with these money hungry parents who was just waiting for a come up. If he had kept his circle tight and focused on his own family, then those dirty allegations would have never happened. But Netflix don't want to talk about money hungry parents or a jury acquittal. They want you to look at their upcoming docuseries and say, fuck the actual legal process, because they want you to think a courtroom verdict don't even matter. And that's fucked up because I really don't believe that he did anything inappropriate. And I'm not just saying it, it's the psychology of it, because think about it. Real predators are sneaky. They work in the shadows, they hide their tracks, and they do everything they can to stay out of the radar. What a real predator don't do is invite a full Hollywood documentary crew into his home and say, hey, look at what I'm doing. Go ahead and record my whole entire life for the world to see. I mean, it just don't make any sense logically. But see, Netflix want everybody to look at their docu-series and treat Michael Jackson like he's just another To Catch a Predator clip. They want to put him in the exact same box, but they're skipping over the most important part of how actual justice works. Because look at the baseline of guilt. When you watch those dudes on To Catch a Predator, how did they get caught? They get caught because of their hidden actions. Their hidden actions match their crooked motives. The evidence is gathered before the handcuffs go on. The chat logs are printed out. The decoys are right there, and the real cops are waiting in the garage. They get caught red-handed because a real investigation has undeniable proof. Nobody's guessing. But when it comes to Michael Jackson, the media playbook is the exact opposite, because the system threw a multi-million-dollar trial at him back in 2005, to where they had hundreds of cops raiding his home and going through his personal files. And they put everything they had in front of a live courtroom for months. And what happened when a real jury sat down and looked at the actual facts? They found him not guilty on all 14 counts. He was acquitted. So what's the purpose of Netflix releasing this documentary? What are they trying to prove? If the state of California couldn't prove a single charge 20 years ago with all the power of the law with a live jury, then how in the hell is Netflix going to prove it now with 3 50-minute edited episodes? And like I said, it's a circus, because in a real sting, the evidence proves the crime. And in this Netflix documentary, the narrative's The Hustle. They're sitting people down in front of a camera over 20 years later, asking them how they feel. They want to throw on some scary background music and try to put a dead man on trial all over again. They want you to think a slick edited documentary has more authority than a real court verdict. They're turning actual justice into a streaming hustle just to make a profit. And they'll do whatever it takes to keep you clicking so you don't cancel your subscription. But the media is only forcing this narrative because jealousy's a beast. It's that green-eyed monster. They hate to see Michael Jackson being number one again, even in death. Because look at the history. When Michael was alive, breaking records and buying up the ATV catalogs, the system panicked. They couldn't control him. So now Netflix want to keep that same old drama running on a loop for a paycheck. And it's sad because you had a black man who stood his ground, faced his accusers, beat the entire system, and walk out of court completely cleared. But they still want him to be remembered as a monster just to get clicks. And if they can do that to him, then the whole concept of innocent until proven guilty don't mean shit in this country. But I hope people are smarter than that. We saw the movie. We know what the court records actually say, and we ain't letting these corporate gatekeepers twist the truth. And I hope that part 2 keeps that same real energy and show him as the global hero that he actually was. So keep your perspective sharp, and don't let a streaming app tell you what justice look like. Peace.